Picture this. A starving man in silk robes kneels in the garden of a palace in Nanjing, China. His name is Hong Xiuquan, and he believes he is the younger brother of Jesus Christ. It is June 1864. The greatest army in Asia is camped outside his walls, and his people are eating weeds to survive. His best general, Li Xiucheng, a man who has won more battles than any commander in the Civil War, walks into the palace and begs him to evacuate the city. Save the army, save the movement, live to fight another day. Hong Xiuquan looks at his general and gives an order that will condemn hundreds of thousands of people to death. He says, "Anyone who flees the city is an apostate and will be executed." Then he goes into his garden, pulls up fistfuls of weeds and eats them. He tells his followers this is manna from heaven God will provide. 3 weeks later, Hong Xiuquan is dead from poisoning or starvation. Nobody is sure which. His body is wrapped in yellow silk and buried beneath the floor of his throne room. His 15-year-old son is placed on the throne of a kingdom that has 6 weeks left to exist. This is the Fall of Nanjing, the final act of a war that killed more people than World War I, and that most of the world has completely forgotten. Before we dive into this forgotten catastrophe, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. That moment in the garden didn't come from nowhere. To understand how a man eating weeds in a palace could represent the final gasp of a war that consumed 40 million lives, you need to rewind 13 years. In 1851, a failed civil service exam candidate named Hong Xiuquan stood on a hilltop in Guangxi province, southern China, and declared himself the heavenly king of a new nation, the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom. He wasn't just another rebel. He was a man who had suffered a nervous breakdown after failing the imperial exams for the 4th time, read a Christian missionary pamphlet, and emerged claiming he had visited heaven, met God the Father, and been told that he, Hong Xiuquan, was the divine younger brother of Jesus Christ, sent to earth to destroy demons. The demons, conveniently, were the Manchu rulers of the Qing Dynasty. Now, in pop culture, when people hear about the Taiping Rebellion, they imagine a ragged mob of peasants with pitchforks. That is a fantasy, pure and simple. The Taiping army was one of the most disciplined, fanatical, and well-equipped fighting forces of the 19th century. They wore uniforms of red jackets and blue trousers. They grew their hair long in defiance of the Manchu-imposed queue, earning the nickname the Long Hairs. They banned opium, alcohol, gambling, and prostitution under penalty of death. They fielded separate men's and women's combat divisions, something no other army on earth was doing in 1851. And they were winning spectacularly. By 1853, Hong Xiuquan's army had swelled to over 500,000 soldiers. They swept north along the Yangtze River like a flood, smashing every Qing garrison in their path. The Qing generals, commanding armies riddled with corruption, opium addiction, and obsolete tactics, crumbled like wet paper. In March 1853, the Taiping captured Nanjing, one of China's greatest cities and a former imperial capital. They killed 30,000 Manchu bannermen and their families in the first days. They renamed the city Tianjin, the heavenly capital, and declared it the center of God's kingdom on earth. For 11 years, the Taiping held Nanjing. They controlled territory containing 30 million people. They manufactured their own firearms, including artillery superior to what the Qing could produce. They collected taxes, administered justice, and printed their own Bible. But there was a rot at the heart of this kingdom, and the rot had a name. Hong Xiuquan, the man who declared himself God's son, retreated into his palace and never came out again. He filled it with 88 concubines. He stopped meeting with his generals. He spent his days writing bizarre theological tracts and issuing edicts from a throne he rarely left. The visionary had become a recluse, and the recluse was slowly going mad. But he still had the power of life and death over every soul in his kingdom. Meanwhile, the Qing dynasty found the one thing it needed to survive: a competent general. His name was Zheng Guofan, a Confucian scholar from Hunan province, a thin, austere man who looked more like a librarian than a warlord. He wore a simple blue cotton gown and carried no weapon. But Zheng Guofan did something no Qing general had managed in a decade of war. He built an army that could fight. This wasn't a reform, it was a reinvention. Zheng raised the Xiang army from scratch, recruiting Hunanese peasants and binding them together with Confucian loyalty rather than imperial decree. He drilled them. He armed them with modern Western rifles and artillery purchased from European dealers. He paid them, which sounds unremarkable until you realize most Qing soldiers hadn't been paid in years. By 1862, Zheng Guofan's noose was tightening around Nanjing. He handed the actual siege operation to his younger brother, Zheng Guoquan, a man with none of his brother's intellectual refinement, but all of his ruthlessness. Zheng Guoquan was a bulldog in a general's uniform, a squat, ferocious commander who had earned his reputation by never retreating from a position once taken. The Taiping's best hope was their finest general, Li Xiucheng, the loyal king. Li was everything Hong Xiuquan was not. He was a former charcoal burner's son, self-educated, physically brave, and brilliant in the field. He wore a captured Qing officer's coat over his Taiping red jacket, a practical man who cared more about winning than about uniforms. He had defeated every army the Qing had thrown at him for years. He was also the only man in Nanjing who understood what was about to happen. And what was about to happen was extinction. The Siege of Nanjing didn't begin with a bang. It began with a slow, methodical strangulation. Through the summer and fall of 1863, Zheng Guoquan captured every position surrounding the city one by one. He took the islands in the Yangtze, cutting off the river supply routes. He took the suburbs, the outer gates, the surrounding towns. By March 1864, his troops had constructed a complete ring of forts, breastworks, and artillery positions encircling the city. Nanjing was sealed. Inside the walls, the population was swelling. Refugees from the countryside poured in ahead of the advancing Qing army, but no food followed them. By spring, the city's granaries were empty. People were eating tree bark, leather, and eventually the weeds growing between the paving stones. Li Xiucheng went to Hong Xiuquan repeatedly, begging him to authorize an evacuation. "There is no food in the whole city," Li told the Heavenly King, "and many men and women are dying. I request a directive as to what should be done to put the people's mind at ease." Hong's response was the one he always gave. God would provide. The angels would descend. Anyone who left was a traitor. This wasn't leadership. It was a hostage situation. And the hostage taker was losing his mind. The comedy of the situation, and it is a dark comedy, is that while Hong was promising divine intervention, over 200,000 of his own soldiers were quietly walking out of the city and surrendering to the Qing. Not in one dramatic moment, but in a steady drip, night after night. Men who had fought for the heavenly kingdom for years simply put down their weapons, slipped through gaps in the not yet complete siege lines, and gave themselves up. Think about that number, 200,000. That is more soldiers than served in the entire Union Army at the Battle of Gettysburg. They didn't desert because they were cowards. They deserted because their king told them God would send food, and God didn't. Hong couldn't stop them. Li couldn't stop them. The kingdom was bleeding to death through a wound that couldn't be bandaged. And Zheng Guoquan, patient as a spider, watched the desertions and smiled. He didn't need to rush. Time was on his side. But Zheng was also under pressure. His soldiers were barely paid and barely fed themselves. They had been campaigning for years, thousands of miles from home. The only thing holding the Xiang army together was the promise of what waited inside Nanjing's walls. The legendary treasury of the Heavenly Kingdom, 11 years' worth of accumulated gold, silver, silk, jade, and plunder from half of southern China. This wasn't just a siege. It was a countdown to a heist, with 1 million men standing between the thieves and the vault. On March 14, 1864, Zheng Guoquan lost patience. He ordered the first direct assault on the walls. His infantry advanced carrying scaling ladders, running at walls that rose over 60 feet above the surrounding plain. The walls of Nanjing were not decorative. They were Ming Dynasty fortifications, some of the most formidable urban defenses in the world, built of fired brick and rammed earth. thick enough to drive a carriage along the top. The Taiping defenders, commanded by Yi, met the assault with concentrated musket and cannon fire from prepared positions on the ramparts. The Qing soldiers climbed into a vertical storm of lead. The ladders splintered, men fell. The attack was beaten back with heavy losses. Zhang Guoquan pulled his infantry out of range and changed tactics. If he couldn't go over the walls, he would go under them. He ordered his engineers to begin digging. 10 tunnels, aimed at 3 different gates: Chaoyang, Shens, and Jinchuan. The objective was to pack the tunnel heads with thousands of pounds of gunpowder and blow the walls apart from below. The Taiping defenders heard the digging. They could feel the vibrations through the stone, a low, persistent rumble that meant death was burrowing toward them. Li Xiucheng ordered counter-tunnels. And this is where the siege turned into something out of a nightmare. Imagine the scene. 20 feet below the surface, in tunnels barely wide enough for 2 men to pass, lit by guttering oil lamps, Taiping and Qing soldiers met in the dark. They fought with swords, spears, and bare hands in spaces so cramped that a man couldn't swing a weapon properly. The Taiping miners broke into Qing tunnels and flooded them with river water or raw sewage. The Qing retaliated with a technique that was uniquely cruel. They let the Taiping miners enter their tunnels, then sealed the exits and pumped in smoke using bellows, suffocating the trapped men in the dark. This wasn't a battle. It was trench warfare 30 years before the trenches of the Western Front. Above ground, the situation got worse. On July 3rd, the Qing finally captured Dibao Castle on the Dragon's Neck ridge of Purple Mountain, the highest point overlooking the city. Zhang Guoquan immediately built dozens of artillery positions and began shelling Nanjing from above. The defenders had nowhere to hide. Every street, every courtyard, every rooftop was now in range. The bombardment fell on a city that was already dying. The streets were full of corpses. The living were too weak to bury the dead. The summer heat of the Yangtze Valley, brutal and wet, turned the unburied bodies into breeding grounds for disease. The smell alone was a weapon. Through all of this, Li Xiucheng kept fighting. He organized counterattacks. He repositioned his shrinking garrison. He rationed what little ammunition remained. The man was trying to bail out a sinking ship with a teacup, and he knew it. But he kept bailing because the alternative was to stand still and drown. Then on June 1st, the news came. Hong Xiuquan, the heavenly king, the younger brother of Jesus Christ, was dead. Some sources say he poisoned himself. Others say he finally succumbed to the diet of weeds he had been eating for weeks. His body was found in the palace, wrapped in embroidered imperial robes, surrounded by the debris of a kingdom that existed only in his imagination. 5 days later, Li Xiucheng was put in charge of everything, but everything was already nothing. July 19, 1864, the day the heavenly kingdom died. At dawn, Zhang Guoquan gave the order. Sappers lit the fuses in the tunnels beneath the Taiping Gate. The ground shuddered, then the wall erupted. A 60-yard section of Nanjing's ancient fortifications blew skyward in a column of brick, earth, and fire. The blast created a breach wide enough to march an army through, and that is exactly what happened. 60,000 Xiang army soldiers surged through the gap. They came screaming, bayonets fixed, driven forward by years of frustration, hunger, and the knowledge that everything inside the city was now theirs for the taking. The Taiping defenders rushed to the breach. They met the attackers in the rubble, fighting hand-to-hand among the shattered brickwork. Swords against bayonets, spears against rifles. The Taiping soldiers, starving and half-mad from months of bombardment, threw themselves at the Qing infantry with the ferocity of men who knew there was no surrender. And here is something that needs to be said. The Taiping did not break easily. These were not peasants collapsing at the first sign of organized resistance. The Qing attackers had modern percussion-cap muskets and field artillery. The Taiping defenders were firing antique matchlocks and hand-forged cannon loaded with whatever scrap metal they could find. The technological gap was enormous, but the Taiping held the breach for hours, piling their own dead into barricades and fighting over the bodies. Li Xiucheng organized a counterattack at the Taiping Gate. He personally led several thousand men in a charge that briefly pushed the Qing back through the rubble. But the numbers were impossible. For every Qing soldier that fell, 10 more climbed through the breach. The Taiping counterattack collapsed under the sheer weight of reinforcements. Li fell back to the palace. He found Hong Xiuquan's 15-year-old son, the young monarch, who had been placed on the throne 6 weeks earlier and had spent every one of those weeks terrified. Li Xiucheng made a decision. He would not stay and die in a doomed city for a dead king's dream. He would take the boy and run. They attempted to break out through the Hangxi Gate with several thousand soldiers. Qing General Chen Ti was waiting. His forces slammed into Li's column and shattered it. Li was forced to retreat to Cool Mountain with his surviving troops. The breakout had failed. At nightfall, Li gathered his remaining force of 1,000 men. They stripped the uniforms from Qing corpses, dressed themselves as the enemy, and crept toward the Taiping Gate. In a piece of black irony that defines the entire battle, they escaped through the breach in the wall because the Qing troops who were supposed to be guarding it had abandoned their posts. They were too busy looting the city to notice 1,000 enemy soldiers walking past them in stolen uniforms. Li Xiucheng gave his horse to the young monarch and told him to ride. The boy vanished into the darkness. Li, now on foot, stumbled through the countryside for 3 days before a group of villagers, hoping for the bounty, betrayed him to a Qing cavalry patrol. The greatest general of the Taiping Rebellion was captured hiding in a temple, exhausted, starving, and alone. Behind him, Nanjing burned. What happened inside the city after the breach was not a battle. It was not even a massacre. It was the complete disintegration of military discipline on both sides of the wall simultaneously. The Xiang army soldiers, unpaid and starved for years, poured into the richest city in southern China and went berserk. They looted everything: gold, silver, silk, jade, furs. They ripped jewelry from the bodies of the living and the dead. They dragged women and children from their homes. Even Zheng Guoquan's own staff officers who entered the city to investigate the looting were robbed and beaten by roving gangs of Hunanese soldiers. The Taiping who remained did not surrender. Zheng Guoquan, the supreme commander, would later write to the emperor a sentence that stands as one of the most chilling in Chinese military history. He wrote, "Not one of the 100,000 rebels in Nanjing surrendered. In many cases, they gathered together and burned themselves, preferring death to capture. They set fire to their own homes. Families barricaded themselves inside and lit the flames together. Groups of soldiers piled their weapons, doused themselves in oil, and struck the match. The fires lasted for a week. When they finally died, the city that had been the capital of the Heavenly Kingdom for 11 years was a smoking ruin for the second time in its history." Between the fighting, the looting, the fires, and the mass suicides, an estimated 100,000 people died in 3 days. Some modern estimates put the number far higher. The city was not liberated. It was destroyed, and nobody saved anyone. On July 22nd, 3 days after the breach, Li Xiucheng was brought to Zheng Guoquan in chains. The meeting between the two generals is one of the most disturbing scenes in the entire war. Zheng Guoquan, the man who had spent 2 years besieging the city, the bulldog who never retreated, looked at the captured Taiping general and did something that reveals the ugliness underneath the victory. He began the interrogation by cutting a piece of flesh from Li Xiucheng's arm with a knife. He might have gone further, but his own officers physically restrained him. This wasn't interrogation. It was revenge wearing an interrogator's mask. 6 days later, Zheng Guoquan himself arrived in Nanjing from Anqing. The elder Zheng was calmer, colder, and more strategic. He ordered Li Xiucheng to write a full confession, a complete account of the Taiping Rebellion from the inside. Li Xiucheng picked up the brush and wrote. Over the course of days, he produced a document of extraordinary detail and intelligence, a narrative of the entire war from the perspective of its finest military mind. He wrote about the battles. He wrote about the betrayals. He wrote about the moment the kingdom began to die. And in his final lines, Li Xiucheng did something nobody expected. He didn't beg for his life. He didn't condemn the rebellion. Instead, he gave the Qing Dynasty advice. He told them to buy the best Western cannon and learn to build them, because the real threat to China wasn't internal rebels. It was the foreign powers who were circling the empire like wolves. The man who had fought the Qing for 13 years spent his last hours trying to save them from the enemy he could see coming. On August 7, 1864, Li Xiucheng was executed. He was 41 years old. The young monarch, Hong Xiuquan's teenage son, was caught weeks later, disguised as a Qing soldier. He was executed publicly. The Taiping Rebellion was over. The numbers are almost impossible to process. Estimates of the total dead range from 20 to 40 million people. Most of them were civilians. Entire provinces were depopulated. The Yangtze River Valley, once the richest region in China, was reduced to a wasteland of burned villages and empty fields. It would take decades to recover. Some areas never fully did. And yet, in the West, almost nobody knows it happened. We know about Gettysburg. We know about Waterloo. We don't know about the Fall of Nanjing, even though more people died in that single siege than in many entire European wars. Why? Because the story doesn't fit any of the narratives we like. It's not a story about plucky rebels defeating an evil empire. The rebels were led by a man who thought he was Jesus' brother and ate weeds while his people starved. It's not a story about a noble government restoring order. The victorious army looted and burned the city they had just liberated. There are no good guys. There are no clean victories. There is only suffering on a scale that defies belief, inflicted by human beings on other human beings for reasons that range from theological delusion to simple greed. The Taiping Rebellion teaches us something that comfortable histories prefer to ignore, that the deadliest wars are not always the ones fought between nations. Sometimes the worst violence comes from within, from people who share a language and a land and a history, turning those shared things into weapons. And the cruelest part? Li Xiucheng was right. The foreign powers were coming. Within decades, the Qing Dynasty would be carved up by the very European nations whose weapons had helped end the Taiping War. The empire that survived the Heavenly Kingdom would not survive the century. So the next time someone tells you World War I was the first modern catastrophe, remember Nanjing. Remember the tunnels. Remember the man who ate weeds and called it divine food. And remember the general who, in his last hours, tried to warn his executioners about the future they couldn't see. If you made it this far, you're a true history enthusiast. Please verify your subscription now. It really helps the channel keep these forgotten stories alive. Check out this next video on the screen about the rise and fall of China's last dynasty, where we explore what happened after the Heavenly Kingdom fell. I'll see you there.